Alright, so today we are going to review what we would need to do to add and subtract decimals. Once again, we're going to kind of get into the why we do what we do a little bit. So if you remember, when we were adding fractions, the common procedure, if we had 3/5 plus 1/10, is to find a common denominator. So you would multiply this by 2, and you would end up with 6/10 plus 1/10, and you would get 7/10. Well, what we do when we're adding decimals is actually very similar to that same idea. Because if I have a number like that, that's really 3/10. And when I add it to a number like this, that's really 78/100. I create a common denominator, and then I can add. So 30 plus 78 would be 108, which would be 1 8/100. But we don't want to take the time to always have to find a common denominator, which then relates to the procedure of lining up our decimal points. So if I take that same problem we were just looking at, when I line up the decimal places, what I'm actually lining up are those common place values, and so those common denominators. So now I'm adding here, I'm adding my hundredths. Here I'm adding ones that are tenths. It's just that we're writing it in a single place. So 0 plus 8 would be 8, 3 plus 7 would be 10, carry the 1. So we'd have 1 8/100, which is what I had over here. So when you're adding and subtracting decimals, obviously the big thing to remember is we want to line up decimal points. So we add and subtract. Common sized pieces. Obviously we're not just going to be adding and subtracting decimals normally. We have the complexity of also adding in our positive and negative values. As you're going through this, we're thinking about using those same types of rules and generalizations we made when we did integers. So for example, if the operations have the same sign, when you're adding, you're going to add the numbers. So for example, if I had negative 3/10 and I'm adding negative 4/100, since they're both negatives, I'm really just adding 3/10 plus 4/100. But since they're both negative, it would be negative 34/100. If they have opposite signs, so a positive and a negative, so for example, if we had negative 32/100, we're adding 4/10. Remember, we're really finding the difference. So here, and then the order doesn't matter. So I'm going to take the 32/100 and I have my 4/10. So I'm actually going to put the 4/10 on top, make it 40/100, so I have that common denominator. So end up with 8 hundredths. And since the 32 hundredths, which was the negative, is smaller than having 4 tenths or 40 hundredths, the positive value is what wins out, so this one would be a positive 8 hundredths. With subtraction, the biggest thing to remember is you can always change it to addition. So if I had 3 and 89 hundredths and I was subtracting a negative 2 and 3 tenths, because we have that minus or the opposite of a negative, we can change that to that plus a positive, and now it's just 389 hundredths plus 2 and 3 tenths. A lot more straightforward for doing our problem. So just keep in mind that as long as you're lining up the decimal points and keeping track of what we're doing with our positives and negatives as you go through, the actual concept of adding and subtracting decimals doesn't change too much.